Well, thanks everybody for joining me for today's event, which is an in conversation with Annette Richards. And I'll properly introduce Annette in just a moment. But before I do, a couple of points of detail or housekeeping. We'll be talking today for about 30 minutes, give or take, and there'll be a nice chunk of time at the end for any questions. So to that end, if you've got questions, you'll see somewhere on your screen, there'll be a questions button and a chat button. It makes it much easier for me if you can put the questions into the questions area and use the chat for general questions about technical things or general conversation about the webinar. But specific questions you'd like me to put to Annette, if you can put them into the questions area, it makes it much easier for me to keep them sorted. We have some of the team online with us, so if there are any other issues, as I said, put them into the chat and we'll try and get onto them straight away. And also today's event is going to be recorded and there will be copies that are going to be provided. And there'll probably be some supporting materials along with those. So that'll go out to everyone who's registered, whether they've attended or not. And we'd really love you to share that with anyone that you know that might be interested in any of today's events as well. We're providing this out as a service to the community, so share it amongst the community as freely as you wish, please. So, my name's John Haley. I'm part of the Australia-New Zealand team here at Opus Centre, and I'm going to be hosting today's event. And so it's my very great pleasure now to introduce you to the guest for today, our featured speaker, Annette Richards. Thank you for joining us, Annette.
Hi, thank you. Thanks for having me.
No, it's our very great pleasure. And you can see a little about Annette on the screen at the moment. And as hopefully most of us know, we're right in the middle of Parks Week here in both Australia and New Zealand at the moment. It runs 6th to the 14th of March. So this is absolutely the perfect time to be talking about and to be acknowledging the really vital role that parks and open spaces create for or play in creating for livable cities and thriving communities. And to that end, as an absolute expert and the Parks and Open Spaces Program Manager at Recreation Aotearoa, and I hope I pronounced that correctly.
Yes.
Annette is absolutely the right person at the right time. So there are a bunch of places we can and we'll go today, Annette, but let's start with the obvious one and we'll branch out from there, which is why is green space, and particularly, but not exclusively green space in urban areas, why is it so important?
Cool. So kia ora, everyone, and thanks so much for tuning in. Yeah, talking about this, I guess we know that there are a lot of benefits provided to us, especially from urban green space that supports the ecological integrity of cities, but these spaces can also protect the public health of urban populations. Trees, for example, in urban areas can reduce air pollution and absorb airborne pollutants from the atmosphere. Green space can cool the temperatures. Trees can help us infiltrate stormwater. Green space can help us replenish groundwater. So, we know that green cover in urban forests can moderate temperatures dramatically, providing shade and helping with the risk of heat-related illness for city dwellers. So when we examine whether green infrastructure, and I use the term quite loosely to include space and parks, when we examine whether this infrastructure can deliver social benefits, the functionality of green infrastructure is influenced by location and distribution, or accessibility across a city. So by improving physical access to green open space and infrastructure, we consequently can provide means for improving equity within urban areas and then enhance the urban livability of our cities. I suppose the reason I'm talking about urban centres a little bit is because the United Nations, for example, report that by 2050, 66% of the world's population will live in a city. And we know that within cities, green space is not always equitably distributed or valued. In many nations, there's a different mindset around what is and what is not a park, what is civic open space. And I sort of like to try and encourage us to look at the totality of civic space, to look at all of those public spaces and how they might connect together or help us connect. Access again is often highly stratified based on income and ethno-racial characteristics, age, gender, disability, and other axes of difference. Over the past 2 decades, the uneven accessibility of access to quality urban green space has been recognised as an environmental issue, a justice issue, as its awareness, of its importance to our health increases. So it's an interesting problem and sort of opportunity. Currently, for a lot of practitioners, there's no clear guidance on how to translate the evidence base on green open space into on-ground action, which creates an opportunity to think differently about, again, that totality of civic space. There's limited information to guide green space practitioners on how much is green enough. There's also a lack of guidance on how to deliver the multiple benefits of green space with finite resources. There's rising costs associated with new land acquisitions and increasing privatisation and encroachment occurring globally. So some positive examples, if we think about cemeteries contributing to this problem. A couple of examples from my experience. One, when I had the privilege to serve the City of Auckland as a parks officer, Waikomiti Cemetery, which is quite a large cemetery in a part of Auckland, which is now experiencing quite extensive, rapid growth, provides this really beautiful, large, established passive recreation opportunity. It contains a huge amount of history and variation of cultures are represented within the space, and there are those opportunities for activation and passive recreation, and it's been great to witness people walking their dogs through this park, people enjoying the open spaces during the summer, taking shade from the trees, and also the really important civic gatherings to commemorate war and other historic events. Another thing that started occurring is in these highly densified areas, we're noticing high-rise developments springing up around some of these spaces, like Waikomiti Cemetery, because I think the value of that open space is being recognised as a place for people living in that densified environment. Another example comes from Nepal, in Kathmandu City. I used to spend a lot of time there before we were restricted from travelling. I did work with the government there on greening the city and helping to establish a urban forest strategy for Kathmandu City, which is an area about half the size of Auckland City in terms of land mass, and has a population of about 6 million people. So, there'd be about 0.25 metres squared of open space per person in Kathmandu City. So what I observed was that one of the big local temples where a lot of the cremations are carried out, a place called Pashuputanath Temple, which dates back to the 5th century. It's basically positioned on the banks of the Bagamati River, kind of near the centre of Kathmandu. This is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It's a sprawling kind of area with a collection of temples and ashrams, images and inscriptions, memorials, and extremely established trees, probably the largest collection of established trees in the city. And during the day, this is a very busy place of cremation, of loved ones gathering and grieving. This process is openly carried out in the public eye by holy men and women who live and work on site. And this is a busy space during the day. As the sun goes down, the whole entire space changes into a site of congregation, of social activity. People pour into the place to gather together in the same spot that during the day is the place of cremation and of grieving for families. And rituals occur, sort of pujas of light occur, involving singing and socializing and tea drinking and praying, and it's very social, it's very alive, it's very friendly. And it was a really interesting experience to observe, because it made me stop and think about the way in which spaces might start their life and what their main core function might be for, and then how that can evolve and change, and how those spaces can be shared and become these multi-use sites that really clearly support the well-being of its citizens. So that was quite an eye-opener for me. Another really awesome example is from Melbourne. I think the pronunciation is Bunurong Memorial Park, which I think started life in 1995 and sort of for a few decades sat as a small cemetery in crematoria in Dandenong, South Melbourne. And about 4 years ago became this sort of larger sprawling memorial park in the southeast of Melbourne, really attempting to transform how Melbourne views the places we bury our dead. So it's a very much so a change of narrative. Cemeteries are for the dead, and memorial parks are for the living and for the families. We don't need to relegate cemeteries to the past and keep them separate or other. We can connect them to the present and plan for their legacy to be a place for the living also into the future. There's so much more than somewhere a deceased person is memorialised. Rather, they're community parkland areas where loved ones are remembered by families, along with a range of other activities, and some of those completely unrelated to death.
Well, you mentioned, right at the start, and you're alluding to it here, I think, that concept of inequality or inequity around access and urbanisation and those types of things. And your example there, I live out in the southeastern area of Melbourne, not too far from where you're talking about. A little bit more. I live right on the urban fringe, so I've got an amazing access to forests and parks, and where I live we have a lake. It's brilliant. My son just recently joined Cub Scouts, which I hope it's a global organisation. I'm sure it translates to New Zealand as well.
Yep.
His school is right near Bunurong or Bunurong. I'm not 100% sure on the correct pronunciation either. His school is right near there. And just the other day, I was talking to one of the parents there about how my son had joined Cubs. And I could see from his expression, and I mentioned that he'd been on a camp recently, and I could see from his expression just this acceptance that he lived a bit more inner, that his son wasn't going to be able to do those things at all. There was no parkland of the scale that we have access to out here. And so, I could, talking to him, it was almost this dismissal of there's no point putting my son into Cubs, because what's he going to do? Go and sit on the footpath and learn how to. So that speaks, I think, to that inequity, but also, the school we were at was so close to the memorial park.
Yeah.
There's an opportunity there, surely.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And there's some really great initiatives out there. I know Auckland Council, for example, in New Zealand, who are really sort of working on that idea of creating opportunities for community to access natural open space and to maybe camp out, with caregivers and with others, and sort of get those opportunities, almost like those sort of old old memories I've got of outdoor education centres when we were children growing up. We got to access so that we had that sense, of connection to nature while sort of really living in a fairly dense suburb.
And and at the same time, as well as that connection, it gives you the opportunity, as you sort of alluded to connect into the cultural side of things in a way that can be challenging as well.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah, and I think there's something around that talks to, I suppose, the need for a bit of a sort of thinking differently approach, where we can create some societal shift and perhaps use the drivers of well-being and sustainability, or equity, access to quality space, to kind of change some thinking there. There's probably a range of things to consider around how we can impact across society, and that also includes, across generations, things that we could do to improve opportunities for people, to improve their position, their well-being, particularly those disadvantaged, and thoughts around how we can impact, to improve inequity. And I think cemeteries play a role in this, absolutely.
You've got this amazing experience, as you alluded to, overseas and locally as well. There is still, I think, a certain amount of institutionalized or culturalized resistance to cemeteries as these types of green spaces. And you spoke about some of the ways of overcoming that. Do you have some thoughts and experience that you can share in that direction?
Yes. So look, I know. I think acknowledging that, I guess the question we have to ask is sort of, well, how can we continue to rethink, cemeteries, for example, as public spaces? And I suppose one of the key things is understanding the complexity, of a cemetery, the history and the complexity of that history. If I think about, I think we were talking about it before we started, the Black Lives Matter movement, the memorialisation, of historic figures, for example, in civic spaces or in parks. Even in New Zealand, that sparks quite a range of debate. How do we memorialise historic figures, for example, or events? And so, cemeteries often contain a rich history around some of these things too. So understanding that, and that, this is a type of space that, as public space, we'll need to consider the sensitive handling of complexities. I think that's really important. And then, we have to also respect people's dignity and those paying their respects. And, active sites, especially ones that are still operating as, crematoria or cemeteries, really we need to balance the roles, within, really respecting the primary function and the reflective nature. So, if we are going to be leading activation of these spaces or tours to help the public learn more about the history of the place, or we're allowing people to walk their dogs, or perhaps a coffee kiosk to be parked nearby for local people walking or playing with their children, that we're doing that in a way that's not going to impact on the dignity of those paying their respects.
And again, sticking to sort of my local experience, I know there's a cemetery here in Victoria, out Rye, that is right near a local primary school, and they have, my understanding, almost an adopt a grave type program where they get some of the students in. There were all kinds of interesting benefits that they've had from that, but I guess it's starting to slowly break down some of those cultural taboos and things through those types of processes as well.
Yeah, and again, I think back to, you've sort of triggered a memory for me, back to that sort of outdoor education experience I was given as a child, where we used to go to do that. Nearby was a historic cemetery, and part of our education, our recreational education, was sort of getting into that space, and almost like a historic kind of treasure hunt, searching out particular graves and learning about the people, learning about the history and the times, as a way of removing that sort of taboo, I suppose, around the purpose of a cemetery, in a way, one of those sort of functional purposes, and yeah, putting the focus on remembrance and on history, and connection to the present. So I think there's something in that. Also, cemeteries need to adapt to survive, because certainly ones with space challenges will eventually sort of have to sort of face that reality that they've run out of space.
Yep.
So being able to open up to the public and share the relevance of the space and the ongoing importance of that place in society, I think is really important. We've seen in the past where we haven't done that so well, and there's a lot we can sort of take from that, that does contribute to the well-being of our citizens today.
And then, again, you sort of spoke about it back at the start. There's the pure play, so to speak, environmental side of this as well. And the pure play in the more literal sense, but it's the environmental side of it. I did a webinar for those of you who attended with Florence Chiquet, talking about natural burials and some of the environmental benefits that type of thing can have. But even just in some of the things you talk about in sort of being urban heat sinks and things like that, right? Yeah,
exactly. And I think that's another thoughtful kind of area for me. Future best practices. We're going to need to think about these things. What the urban kind of requirements are. For green infrastructure, for green open space, for social connection, which we know supports well-being. And planners and designers alike are going to need to be considering these things, and they are, especially around the practice, which is still very, very popular and will continue to be, around densification, of urban sites, especially the creation of compact cities. We need to be really thinking about those urban green spaces by way of close proximity, and type, design, size, variation, and I suppose the ideas of connectivity as well, as you were just talking to before, around the involvement of nature, greenery, in solving problems in the built environment. So yeah, I guess my sort of thought is, well, why can't cemeteries be a part of that equation? And I know that they are, and they're becoming more so, but that there's still some sort of societal shift required, some thinking differently that we need to get our heads around there.
And we've touched on it a little bit as well, but that idea of everyone's heard that sort of phrase, shared grief, and these types of things that bond a community. I mean, is there an opportunity for, shall we say, cross-pollination of cultural ideas within a cemetery? And what does that do for bringing a community together with a shared, genuine sense of community across cultures? Is there any sort of experience or thoughts around that type of concept?
Yeah, I mean, look, the first one that instantly comes to mind for me, and it might not necessarily on the face of it seem exceptionally cross-cultural, but I think it generally is, would be the commemorations that we see occurring within some of our larger cemeteries, for Anzac Day and that kind of thing. And I suppose why that springs to mind is just really witnessing the history, I suppose, of our nation and the people that come together and actually congregate. It draws in the whole community, young, old, all sorts of different people, different cultures. So yeah, so if we're able to do that and come together for sort of a common purpose, then when I think about some of the qualities I've admired overseas in the developing nations, especially in Nepal and India, there's some really amazing social kind of congregational type events there that are also about grief, sharing of grief, but are also very celebratory. That we could absolutely look to include or widen our kind of minds around.
And I guess in a similar way of trying to work the community into an environment. Actually, the pictures on screen at the moment are from Bendigo, and I did a session with Annie de Jong, for those of you who attended here, and I was really impressed by some of the initiatives they've done to bond themselves to the local community. One of which in particular, they have an amazing quantity of roses out there, and at the right time of year they invite the community to come in and learn about how to prune roses. Which is such a, when I heard it, I thought, what a fantastic idea. But again, what a great way to broaden the use of the green space, to blend yourself into the community, and to break some of those taboos and get people coming into cemeteries and use them as a pure green space, not just a place of death care and mourning.
Absolutely. I mean, absolutely. I think the public realm, and I guess we've got to think about it that way. It really does affect our humanity and our enjoyment of life. So if we're thinking about the totality of civic space and how we can connect, all of these parts of our sort of civic environment together, in a way that is inclusive, for everyone to sort of use in their own way, in their own different ways, then we're onto something quite clever there. Recently, I went through a small town in New Zealand called Ratahi, and they've done, it's a small town, but they've done an amazing job of just through the use of shared kind of pathways, fairly wide kind of shared pathways running through the town, either side of the road. They've managed to connect people to their really historic cemetery. They've connected people to historic kind of artifacts from their agricultural past. They've connected people to the river and the waterways and the township, just with a really simple kind of design, I suppose, that encourages people to include these places along the way, if that makes sense.
Yeah, sort of almost, if I'm understanding what you're saying, it's almost a jogging track that leads you from point of interest to point of interest.
Yeah. So what would have been, a fenced off separate other place as a cemetery before is now part of the experience, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it becomes you don't have that clear interstitial break from place to place.
Yeah. So there's a whole lot of ways of doing that, by using that, again, what I call that total civic space. And often, we're talking sort of, in some cases, very large kind of road reserve environments, in some places. So it will vary, but I think the totality of civic space is what matters. It's not just a few good parks or a few good buildings. And ensuring that there's a way for everyone to be able to enjoy those spaces in all their forms, really.
So not to cut across the conversation, but I do notice that we've just hit onto our time. We've still got a bit more time, but I'll just move through a couple of things, and we have got some additional time, as I said, and a few questions, and please do throw any more that you've got into us. But before we get into that, I'll get the end of session bookkeeping out of the way. And you can see on screen at the moment our Open Centre website. So as I've said at the end of all of these types of events, we're trying to do this for the death care sector. We're trying to provide an opportunity for learning and education on throughout the sector. So if there's topics that you'd like to see or hear about, reach out to us and let us know. But equally on our website, you can see just a screenshot there from our events section. You can see today's session, our next upcoming event, using technology to build your sales pipeline or funnel. And I know that coming up after that, and for those of you who go to the website, we've got a really interesting another session on the idea of gaining visibility and building relationships within the community. So, you know, some of what we heard today, it even touches on some of the things I had a conversation with, as I mentioned, with Annette Richards from Ballarat Cemeteries. She talked around this a little bit. And any of you who didn't attend that, let us know and we can get you a recording, because that was a really fascinating conversation, I thought, as well. But take a look around our website, reach out, let us know what you'd like to hear about, and register for anything that does catch your eye. And do throw in any questions, because we do still have a little bit of time. And I'm going to return to you, Annette, although you've blanked your screen for a moment, but I know you're still there.
I am.
I've got a handful of questions here that I'm all going to kind of
Okay.
lump together, because they all probably address the same core issue. And it's a tough one, I know, but I'm sure it's one that you've got some experience. We touched on it lightly, which is that idea of the cemetery being perhaps somewhere a little bit taboo or other, and trying to, you know, put these offers and opportunities out there, but to find a way to break through and get the community into there, I suppose, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and look, I think it's as I've sort of alluded to, yeah, we were talking about before, there are those challenges, and we have to really consider how to balance things. But obviously, working with the community, working with all of the stakeholders, and generally there'll be quite a range of people, is key. You know, developing relationships and really investing in taking time to listen and to hear different perspectives and points of view, and even in some cases setting up some not necessarily super formal, but some sort of framework or governance around that, so that you know, there is progress that can be made towards solutions that the community feel they've had a say in making happen, if you know what I mean. Servant leadership, I suppose, is what I'm getting at, and if, you know, if we do it right, people will say that they've done it themselves. You know what I mean? That's a really good litmus test for servant leadership. If the community says, well, hey, look what we managed to achieve here, then, you know, people like myself have done their job properly.
Yep.
Yeah.
I think that's an absolutely 100% beautiful segue into another question we've got here from the audience, around the idea of volunteers, and particularly in this case around volunteer gardening within the cemeteries. And I hope I'm pronouncing this, not butchering it too badly, but, you know, there's a particular question about Te Hanui Cemetery in New Plymouth, where apparently volunteers do all of the gardening, and it's actually included in the Taranaki Garden Festival, because they've done such an amazing job. And, you know, I think in that case, as you say, the community is clearly so embedded within the cemetery environment there, that they're delivering an amazing outcome, right? I
mean, that's fantastic. Yeah. And look, you know, so many civic institute, you know, so many kind of councils, I suppose, for want of a better word, if they haven't already, they may find themselves, you know, financially in the future unable to kind of provide the full level of service that, you know, a place might deserve in terms of the funding they're given. So, you know, being able to connect with volunteers, with the local community, with friends of, you know, of a place, and extend that bang for buck, extend that, you know, service level and that care that is deserved, so deserved, is a fantastic outcome. Obviously there's challenges at times with any form of voluntary service. There has to be the managing of health and safety aspects, and there has to be some sensitivities considered when we're talking about graves, especially because obviously they belong to family members. So it's really important that the family members are comfortable and happy with what's occurring. But it's such a brilliant way to also engage a really important part of our community who have a lot to offer, and they themselves also gain a lot of well-being from that social connection and from being of service. So yeah, while volunteers might be seen sometimes as a challenge, ultimately people are the solution, definitely not the problem.
Yep.
If that makes sense. Yeah.
There's another one here, and I'm going to paraphrase this one a little bit.
Cool.
We've spoken a little bit about the benefits that green space can provide in that urban environment, and if you've got a moment, I love that statistic you provided, that I think it was 66% of the population. We'll come back to that maybe in a minute, but the question here is sort of looking at that from the other direction. What of that, if anything, can we lift and apply to a more regional environment where there is perhaps a little bit more green space available?
Oh, I mean, yeah, it's such an interesting one, isn't it? Look, I'm a person too who's left a city, and I live in a little tree house in the country, and sort of try my best to work remotely or travel a lot in order to work. And I think there's definitely different ways to do things, and there's something to be said for encouraging dispersal, absolutely, of people across space. But the reality is that for whatever reason, people perceive cities as being these places of opportunity, of necessity, and they gravitate to them. And I don't believe that those trends are going to change anytime soon. And beyond things such as housing supply, unemployment levels, pollution, infrastructure, that impact the quality of our living, we still have to really think about how we can provide quality infrastructure, green infrastructure and spaces for people in those city environments. I don't think we're going to solve that one overnight, unfortunately.
No, not an easy one by any means, I wouldn't have thought.
No.
And sorry, I maybe didn't quite express that correctly. What about where we do find ourselves? I live on the urban fringe. Sounds like you do as well, where we do have a little bit more accessibility. Are there any lessons from the more urban environments that can be applied out to the more regional environments, or vice versa?
Yeah, sorry. Yes, I get
okay.
Yeah, so I think there's some really interesting literature out there now. I think Auckland City, for example, are looking at this as well, around making more viable, I suppose, the business and I suppose the opportunities for people where they live. So that idea of more nodal kind of living, where you work where you live, and you don't have to necessarily cross the entire city from one side to the other to go about your business or to do your job, if that makes sense. So I think there is definitely a lot more planning and thought going into how we can make that a reality for people. I mean, do you have to commute at the moment for your work?
Well, I suppose we have perhaps a pre and post COVID reality. Yeah, certainly in this role, we're such a diverse community here in the death care sector that there's always going to be quite a lot of travel. But I think back into some of my earlier working life, there have been times when I've been sitting in traffic for literally an hour and a half just to get to the office, and that's no kind of fun.
Yeah, and I think that's a reality for a lot of people. So I know there's a lot of interest, especially from those sort of city planners and people thinking about the long-term future, about how we can make where people live, more sustainable and kind of, I suppose, in terms of service, able to provide you with what you need there, so that there isn't so much of that travelling around, which should also take some pressure off the whole system, the whole network.
Another one here, and I'm going to use the example that we got before about Te Anui. I hope I got that vaguely right.
Yeah.
I know a lot of the smaller cemeteries are run by volunteer trusts where they have such a limited bandwidth, right, of their time, and so much of it is just consumed with keeping the trust operational and the cemetery vaguely running.
Yeah.
Do you have any experience or insights or anything you can put to that besides sympathy around the idea of these smaller trusts and how they can propagate the great resource that we have in these cemeteries amongst the community? Does that make sense? Have I expressed that correctly?
You have. Look, I mean, this might not be something that that necessarily feels right for everyone out there, but we've seen this in other parts of our industry, in the parks and recreation industry, where there comes a time or a need to collaborate, I suppose, or to even consider alliances, or how, if we can't co-locate, then how we can actually share resources, share cost perhaps, by joining forces, if that makes sense. So it could be through organisations, or it could be through partnership agreements. There's probably a range of ways to maybe just think beyond the boundaries of the place, and find those others that could be having a shared experience, and maybe by joining forces more can be achieved, if that makes sense.
Yep. So I'm conscious of time, and we're probably right up against our stop time now.
Yep,
but
sure.
I don't know whether you've watched one of these, so whether this will come to you as a surprise or not. But I like to try and end these with a question, which is, what is the question that I haven't asked you, Annette, that you think that I should have? Or what are the closing words that you would like to put across to us all?
Sure. Okay,
there's a tough one for you.
I think the biggest question would be, and I have touched on this, but I think all of us need to consider, what we can do essentially to impact across society and across generations, in order to support the well-being of others. I think for me that's the key thing we all need to be thinking about now.
So that concept of servant leadership.
Absolutely. And I suppose I can't help it, but our leader in New Zealand, Jacinda, talks a lot about kindness and empathy, and so it sort of resonates for me as well, how we can help others in the community, especially those less advantaged.
Well, that I think is an excellent note to end on. Thank you very much for your time. I hope the audience found it as fascinating as I did. I've enjoyed our conversations leading up to this, and certainly today. So thank you very much for your time, Annette.
Thank you.
As I've said before, this will be, or has been, recorded, and so we'll be putting out the recording to anyone that has registered, and please feel free to share that widely and openly. My contact details are on screen. Reach out to me. I'm sure Annette would be more than happy for me to connect through to her if you'd like to be put in touch with her. And finally, if there's something else that you'd like us to talk about in future, reach out, let us know. Or if you have something that you would like to say and would like a forum for it, reach out, let us know, because this is all about trying to provide a platform and a voice interesting out to the death care sector. So Annette, once again, thank you so much for your time. I really enjoyed it. And thank you to everybody else. And we will cut it off there. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Ka kite.